In the early 1870s, the U.S. promoted the expansion westward by making the southeast corner of Kansas available for homesteading. This area, now known as Labette County, sitting just one county west of Missouri, being crossed by the Oklahoma-Kansas state lines, this provided a prime location for early settlers. In the late 1870s, John Bender Sr. and his alleged son, John Jr., arrived in the area to lay claim to a 160-acre plot in addition to a long, narrow piece of ground just north of the acreage. This was sure to keep other settlers from getting too close. As most early settlers, John Sr. and Jr. quickly constructed a 16 by 24-foot shell that would become the Bender Inn and Grocery. In the fall of 1871, Ma Bender and daughter Kate joined the Bender men. Shortly after their arrival, household furnishings and supplies were purchased in Ottawa, Kansas, about 100 miles north of the new homestead. When the Bender women were finally settled in, they hung a wagon-covered canvas to divide the cabin into two rooms. The smaller back of the two rooms would become the Bender's living quarters. The front portion would be used as the inn and grocery store, which provided a good overnight resting spot for weary travelers. John Bender Sr., also known as Pa, who was previously known as John Flickinger, was about 60 years old, and by all accounts was a large-framed, broad-shouldered man that could have stood over 6 foot tall had it not been for his habitual stoop. Pa only spoke in German and rarely spoke at all when strangers were around. Although he and his wife were believed to be German immigrants, they spoke in such guttural accents that no one could be certain. Elmira Griffith, or Elmira Meek, also known as Miss John Bender or Ma Bender, mothered at least a dozen children before her husband's questionable demise. Ma would later have several husbands. Ma was about 55 years old, a slow-moving, heavy-set, poor-postured woman with a decided accent. Ma spoke broken English as well as German, but not very talkative. Nearby neighbors frequently referred to her as a she-devil. The men in the Bender household were believed to fear, dread, and obey her. John Bender Jr., who was previously known as John Gabhard, was about 25 years old. John was a tall, slim man and possessed an awkward country boy good looks. Many thought he was a half-wit, laughing aimlessly at anything that he had said. This could have been the most clever disguise. John spoke English fluently, but also with a German accent. Eliza Griffith, or Sarah Davis, was the youngest of the Bender family. Known as Kate Bender, she was about 20 years old and stood about 5 foot 6 inches tall. She was slender and by all accounts a beautiful young woman. Kate claimed to be a spiritual medium or a psychic, conducting seances and giving lectures about spiritualism. Kate, of all the Bender family, was the most social. She frequently attended church functions and meetings at the Harmony Grove Schoolhouse. Kate was quickly accepted by the community. She longed for wealth and notoriety and would get this by any means necessary. According to published records, the Benders operated an inn and grocery from the winter of 1871 to the spring of 1873. Sitting off of the Osage Trail, the only road open for travel at the time, the Bender Inn and Grocery was a prime spot for tired travelers to stop in for a safe overnight stay. Many of these travelers carried large sums of money in order to settle in some of the new areas available for settlement. Due to infrequent contact with family, these settlers could disappear and their disappearances would go unnoticed for some amount of time. In the late spring of 1873, these disappearances became the talk of the Osage Township meetings. Among the residents attending the meetings was John Bender Sr. and Jr. Tension hit the highest when the disappearance of Dr. William York of Independence, Kansas came up missing. Dr. York was reported missing from the Osage Trail after a brief visit to Fort Scott. The townspeople decided a complete search of all the homesteads in the area would be mandatory. The searches were put on hold for several days due to bad weather, but commenced quickly. When the searchers arrived at the Bender property and entered the cabin, they immediately noticed that the cabin was deserted. Leroy Rick, who directed the searches, reported that he was met by a sickening stench upon entering the cabin. A trapdoor was discovered in the floor of the cabin and was pulled open to reveal a hole that was filled with clotted blood. This apparently was the source of the horrid odor. The cabin was lifted and moved out of sheer desperation to allow for better search of the area. Although nothing was found in the cellar, Dr. York's body was quickly found, buried head down. His skull had been bludgeoned and his throat was slit. The next day, 9 additional bodies were found on the Bender property, all of which apparently had been killed in the same fashion. Along with the 9 other bodies, searchers discovered dismembered body parts of other bodies. A man and young girl, believed to be his daughter, were found buried together in one grave. The girl had no evidence of violence to her body, so it is easy to summarize that she was buried alive with her slaughtered father. After long hours and gruesome discoveries, the orchard where the bodies were found was dubbed Hell's Half Acre by the other searchers. On May 17, 1873, Governor Thomas O'Brien put up a reward for $2,000 for the apprehension of all four suspects. The reward was never claimed. 14 victims in all were discovered on the Bender property in the apple orchard, along with dismembered body parts of several of the victims. Some believe the Benders could have killed up to 21 people. However, there is no true number of victims that we can attribute to the Bloody Bender. It was believed that Kate was the driving force behind the murderous scheme. Most also believe her to be the actual killer, the one who sliced her victims' throats from ear to ear. It was believed that Pa Bender would sneak out from behind the canvas partition and hit the unsuspecting guest in the head with a hammer. Kate would then finish them off with her knife. It was determined that the motive behind the killings had to be money. Most of the victims were traveling settlers that would most likely be carrying the family's life savings. The amount of money that was looted from the victims is unknown, but the investigations show that the range of money could have been taken was between 40 cents and $2,600. This doesn't seem like much money, but according to the inflation charts, $2,600 would be about $46,000 in today's economy. 5 of the victims were thought to be carrying at least $1,900. The Benders could have stolen a sum close to $250,000. Although it has been well over a century, the gruesome atrocities of the Bender farm have not been forgotten. There was a museum founded and still operates in Cherryville, Kansas. In fact, some believe the former Bender property is haunted to this day by its victims. Their story remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of the Old West.